Okay, I originally wanted to do this video when I had read all of Stephen Graham Jones's works and do just one video of recommendations and a deep dive. And I decided, you know what, screw it. I've already read a ton of his works, and so this, I figure, is going to be part one of that deep dive. I'm going to go over all of the books that I have read that have books and collections and stories, every work that I've read by Stephen Graham Jones thus far, call it a bunch of mini reviews, call it a recommendation video, I don't care. Either way, we are going to do this, and we are going to talk about Stephen Graham Jones. So this is part one. I first was introduced to Stephen Graham Jones through Mongrels. This is a coming of age literary horror novel about, guess, werewolves. And it is told in alternating perspectives, but it's the same perspective. So you get the narrative of the the main character Darren as he's living in his life, and then alternate chapters are of a character. So a vampire, someone's dressed up as a vampire, someone's dressed up as a detective, and that character's never named, but it's definitely Darren, but in these type of guises. It's just a coming of age novel about a young boy who wants to become a werewolf. He lives in a family of werewolves. It is less horrifying than Stephen Graham Jones's other works, so I definitely recommend this as a good starting place, and not just because it's where I started with his works. Following Mongrels, I read The Only Good Indians, and this all started in 2020, by the way, and I'm pretty sure I read this soon after release, because I think this came out in 2020. Yes, it did come out in 2020. So I read it soon after release, and this is a literary horror novel that is following a group of people. The inciting incident is these group of men go on an elk hunt. And this novel is about the repercussions of that elk hunt and the vengeance that this entity has on this group of people and how it impacts those around them. It is incredibly gruesome. It's If you don't like animal torture or gore, I would definitely tread and enter with caution when reading this book. The next Stephen Graham Jones book I read was The Least of My Scars. This is a serial killer novel, and at least I, was very unmoored, but in a good way. I had no idea what was going on. Things were incredibly horrifying, like body horror galore. And there was a lot of unreliable narrator going on in this, and I really, really, really enjoyed it. It's a pretty short novel, 183 pages. So it's a very short novel, not a novella, but it's definitely a short novel. And if you like unreliable narrators, if you like serial killers, I would definitely recommend this, but also be wary that there's a lot of body horror and gore in this one. Zombie Bake Off. Zombie Bake Off is literally the novel that made me realize that I can just have fun while reading. If you know me, I don't really read to have fun. I don't like to have fun, apparently, while reading and or in general. But this is a novel form of probably like a D-list horror movie. It is just pure and utter fun, and it's what the title implies. It's about a bake-off, and there's zombies, and there's also wrestlers. So it's just really, really fun. And the next one is actually, it's a good segue, just convenient that I read it. It's another novel that reads like a movie, reads like a horror movie, and that's The Last Final Girl. And the way that this is actually structured, is that you are in the perspective of, like, a camera. In the narrative talks about, like, panning to the left or pulling back, and there's camera cues, written on the page, but it is a novel. And this is, as the title implies, about the last final girl. So it is a slasher novel. And what I really, really like about this book is that you can see the seeds that he lays in later books, specifically My Heart is a Chainsaw and in the Indian Lake trilogy. So I enjoyed it for what it was, and for seeing where elements of My Heart is a Chainsaw started. Mapping the interior. This is a novella. It is literary. It is got a good amount of body horror, and it is just about this young Native American boy who is trying to survive, live and survive in poverty and in a trailer park. He is haunted, maybe not, maybe haunted, maybe not, by his father, and you just follow him as he's having to deal with life and this haunting. Night of the Mannequins. This is another novella, and similar to Least of My Scars, it is a very much an unreliable narrator, and the inciting incident of this is that these kids are playing a prank with a mannequin at a movie theater, and things go weird when the mannequin maybe comes alive, but you would think that this would become like a horror story about the mannequin, and it's not. It is about these group of friends, and it is, I would say it's the anti-coming of age story in that it is about this group of friends and how desperate they can be, desperate even, for their friendship as they grow. The next one that I read was chapter 6, and this is a story. It is a literary zombie novel, and it is written as an academic essay. It's almost an anthropological, sociological look at the zombies in this world. And there are, for being such a short story, I think it's less than 20, 30 pages. It is incredibly horrifying. There's one particular scene that is still sticks with me to this day. If you don't like animal horror, tread with caution. I followed up that short story with a short story collection, Zombie Sharks with Metal Teeth, and it's got a wide variety of stories in it. The titular Zombie Sharks with Metal Teeth, it's misleading in that there are not any zombie sharks, and they definitely don't have metal teeth. But this collection I thought was great. There's a lot of like really short stories in here. There are 23 stories across this 150 page collection. There's one story in particular that I am so interested to reread, and it's called I Was a Teenage Slasher Victim. So I want to reread it after I read I Was a Teenage Slasher. But this is a really great, there's a wide variety. There's horror, there's science fiction. So I think it gives you a good sampling of the breadth of the types of stories that Stephen Graham Jones can tell. His writing style is consistent through all of them, but the breadth of his storytelling is really showcased here in this collection. I read another collection, quasi-collection, 3 Miles Past. This is actually a collection of 3 novellas. I would say it's more literary horror than anything. The way that it's described on the back of this book is that In these 3 novellas, the dead talk, ancient evil opens its eyes, and that guy across the parking lot, he's watching you and has been for a while now. So there's a even across these 3 novellas, there's a breadth of the types of stories that Stephen Graham Jones is telling, and I think they're just really interesting. And I'm pretty sure that this has been republished since it's been out of print for a while. Another one that's been republished because it was out of print is Sterling City. This is a very short novella. I would argue that this is like sci-fi horror and even like a little eldritch horror as well. It is about a man whose marriage is over, and you really just follow him, and nothing really weird happens until something weird happens. And I'll just put it at that. It's not particularly horrifying, it's just weird, and I actually think this is a good place to start with Stephen Graham Jones's works. It's short, it's not particularly gory or horrifying, but it's incredibly, incredibly interesting. The Backbone of the World. It is a story. It is one that is similar to Sterling City in a way. It's very eldritch, and it's more. I would argue it's more literary in its horror as well. And it's just following a woman who is back on a prairie farm, and she's having to deal with these prairie dogs that have invaded her land. And yeah, that's all I can really say about it without spoiling anything because it's obviously a short story. Then I read Leadfeather. This is a definitely literary horror novel. Um, Even saying it's horror is probably a stretch. It's definitely literary, maybe even sci fi, maybe even historical. There are 2 perspectives where you follow this young man who is actually, it's not even from his perspective. You see this young man, you follow him through other people's eyes. And then it switches over to a perspective in the 1800s. And it feels somewhat disjointed using these 2 perspectives, so to speak. But then it all comes together in a really incredible, for me, incredible way. This is one of my favorite Stephen Graham Jones novels, next to Mongrels and The Least of My Scars. I think the craft and execution of this novel is just really, really good. And I'll just say that I think Stephen Graham Jones has a thing for elk, deer, those types of creatures. The Elvis Room is another story that is, well, a story. It follows a man who is investigating the titular Elvis Room, which is apparently, I don't know how true this is, a room that is left open always in every hotel just in case. It follows this man as he's investigating the titular Elvis Room, and he goes to a particular hotel and things happen. Then Attack of the 50-Foot Indian is a story that plays on the the popular cultural depiction of Native Americans as well as the kind of 50s era, 40s, 50s era of, Attack of the 50-Foot Woman or whatever those shows were called. And in such a short story, Stephen Graham Jones flips the expectations of the narrative with this story. And for me, I actually felt quite deeply for the titular 50-Foot Indian. It's really, really good. And then the entire Indian Lake trilogy. I read My Heart is a Chainsaw in 2021 when it came out. And then I read Don't Fear the Reaper in 2022 when it came out. And then the latest book that I read by Stephen Graham Jones was The Angel of Indian Lake. Now, this trilogy, I already alluded to it when I talked about The Last Final Girl. But this is a slasher horror series. And again, seeing those seeds in The Last Final Girl and seeing them become what they become with Jade Daniels as this main character throughout this trilogy is incredibly, incredibly beautiful. It's incredibly gory. Called a slasher for a reason. And I'm not even a fan of slasher movies, but I adored this series. The first book in particular, there are these interlude chapters of what they call slasher 101s, and it's essentially Jade Daniels. She's writing a paper for her history class about slashers. And through these Slasher 101 interlude chapters, through this paper that Jade Daniels is writing, we are learning about slashers. For anyone that is not aware of all the tropes and the things that happen in slashers, it is actually really helpful, and it added to my enjoyment of the series. I would imagine if you are aware of slashers and you like slashers, it probably was a great reminder and a fun kind of homage to slashers to read the interludes. But the story itself, Jade Daniels as a character is incredibly, incredibly incredible. She is one of my favorite characters. She's awesome. She's badass. She is obsessed with slashers, and these slashers just keep coming to her town. And it's just great. I don't know how well this is going to be, but yeah, that's part one. Stay tuned for part two.